With the last few updates, we got a lot of stuff added into the game, most notably the completion of V1's arsenal. Although the full game isn't out yet, I'm going to be ranking every weapon, alt variant, and arm in ULTRAKILL. Also, these are personal opinions from my experience playing the game, so please try not to crucify me in the comments for giving your favorite weapon a bad rank. But now, sit back, relax, and let's begin. The stock piercer is a classic of ULTRAKILL and is the first weapon you get in the game. At face value, it's a very solid firearm, having a nice moderate damage piercing alt attack that's good for nailing several enemies at once in the first few levels. Unfortunately, it's pretty much all it's good for, especially after it gets completely overshadowed by its cooler alt variant. The damage its primary fire does is pretty much obsolete after the prelude, and the alternate slab revolver's secondary fire is simply better in terms of, well, anything really. The slightly longer recharge is pretty negligible, as the revolvers are usually used for a once-in-a-while piercing shot to finish off an enemy or snipe a core. All in all, it's not terrible, but gets pretty useless and overshadowed by other variants. Chaotic tier. Unless you're under the mayo, of course, then this is the only weapon you use for some reason. The slab piercer, however, is a whole different story. After we unlock it in Limbo, it pretty much becomes the go-to burst damage revolver. Its piercing shot is buffed, and so is its damage, which makes it perfect for its job. The longer cooldown and nerfed firing rate is pretty much negligible since it's not your primary source of damage anymore, and can be easily negated by just switching weapons. The slab in the end is a pretty much direct upgrade to the stock piercer at the point in the game where we unlock it. Solid supreme tier. The stock Marksman. I'm pretty sure a lot of people share my opinion, but this is genuinely the single best weapon in the game. The fact that we can access it so early on is absolutely criminal, as it stays utmost useful throughout the entire game. The amount of interactions this gun has are incredible, both with other weapons and arms. Pretty much any, even slightly complex technique builds off of the Marksman revolver's coins, which gives it almost unlimited amounts of uses. Very easy ULTRAKILL tier. The alternate version of the Marksman, however, is a bit of a different story. It trades the firing speed as well as the split shot ability of the stock for a higher damage and piercing. I, as well as many other people, find this trade-off to be extremely situational, as I usually just use the coin for either attack with something like the rail cannon or to just finish off a few lightweight enemies. I've found that the stock's higher firing speed and split shot ability is simply more useful in more situations, more than the somewhat inconsistent damage boost that the slab Marksman has to offer. I know this variant has received some buffs in relation to other alt revolvers, but it's honestly still very situational and doesn't pay off in most cases. Again, not great, but not terrible either. Chaotic tier. Stock Sharpshooter. Apart from the Marksman, this is probably the pistol I've caught myself using the most throughout my playthroughs, at least until I unlocked the slab variant. The ricochet function is extremely versatile, and the fact that the charged shots detonate projectiles makes the weapon as a whole great for crowd clearing, as well as one-shotting certain enemies like the malicious face, although the tech is not nearly as consistent, at least for me. The stock version gets brutal tier. The alt Sharpshooter is where it gets fun. The higher damage and penetration do wonders to make the use of the ricochet techniques even more effective, especially in conjunction with the Marksman coins. Although the charge time is significantly higher for the secondary fire, I don't see it as much of a drawback at all, since the increased damage manages to outweigh it a lot. Sadistic tier for me. Moving on to the shotguns. The stock core eject shotgun is pretty great overall. The primary fire, as on all shotguns, is a consistent source of damage, and projectile boosting the pellets is good for splash damage. This specific variant's alt fire is also not half bad. On its own, the core eject does moderate damage and can be used in conjunction with hitscan weapons and coins for higher explosive outputs, which can be very fun to pull off. Unfortunately, that's pretty much it when it comes to tech. I usually just mostly use a primary fire on this, as core snipes and nukes aren't something I happen to use very often in my playthroughs, although I do understand that the gun is way more useful in the hands of people who are just simply better than me. So it's just a case of skill issue, I guess. The blue variant gets brutal tier. The overpump shotgun is honestly one of my favorite weapons in the game. This is mostly in part to the fact that it's stupidly easy to use efficiently, and the damage you can pull off with the max charge explosion and dashing are just crazy. It really doesn't disappoint in terms of ability as well. Pseudo rocket jumps are super fun to pull off. The overpump is simply a really fun gun to use, and this is why I give it a generous sadistic tier. The sawed-on shotgun. The consistent melee damage you can deal combined with a cool and useful gimmick, and its uses with both the magnet and the arms while still retaining the abilities of the stock shotgun make it really good in my book. Not much really to say here, Supreme Tier. I've just found myself being more efficient with this variant, both in terms of damage output and tech. The star of the show is definitely Jackhammer, the alt version of the shotgun. It inherits the 3 variants just like the stock shotguns, so let's begin with the core eject Jackhammer. I'm not afraid to say that this is probably one of the most fun weapons in the game. Not only does the damage and knockback scale with speed, but the core can also be thumped and turned into a hit scan attack, allowing it to bounce off of coins like the malicious rail cannon. This also applies to other projectiles like rockets, which can be turned into hit scan beams. There's unfortunately no way you can really interact with the core other than thumping it, since it has much more reduced range. Overall, a solid sadistic tier. The overpump Jackhammer is just as good as its normal counterpart, if not better. Since the Jackhammer is practically a melee weapon, there is a lot more motivation to go get up close and personal to deal a shit ton of burst damage. Also, if I remember correctly, the explosion for the final pump is actually red, which means even more damage on a successful hit. The rate at which you can deal this damage is slightly nerfed due to the Jackhammer's slow rate of fire and cooldown period after a high speed hit, but this proves to be negligible if you use this variant in conjunction with other weapons. Very, very good weapon, even in the hands of players like me suffering from chronic skill issue. Shitstorm tier. The sawed-on Jackhammer is, in my opinion, the weakest of the 3 variants. It also inherits the chainsaw projectile that the shotgun has, which interacts with arms as normal, but can also be pushed by the Jackhammer's piston and kind of juggled. This is unfortunately as deep as the interactions get, and this variant doesn't really excel at anything in particular, and doesn't really have any good incentive to use it, like, at all. That is, unless you're using it for the chainsaw and the Jackhammer mechanics separately, and leaving the other 2 variants to do something like shotgun swapping. Destructive tier. Moving on to the nailguns. The blue or attractor nailgun is the first variant you unlock, and honestly turns out to be the most useful in most situations. Not only do they provide a very potent trap to deal massive amounts of damage via the 3 magnets, but they can also attract other projectiles like rockets and on chainsaws. It does take quite a bit to reload all of the nails, but other than that, it's a very good source of burst damage. Anarchic tier. The overheat nailgun is the definition of burst damage in ULTRAKILL, maybe only second to the railguns. Insanely high damage output for a few seconds shreds quite a lot of enemies in a pinch, not to mention the fact that it can also be turned into a nail trap with the attractor's magnets. However, the heat sinks that let this variant dish out so much damage do take a whopping 8 seconds to recharge, leaving you with a very weak nailgun in the meantime, making it only useful for a once-in-a-while overheat barrage. Again, this can be widely negated just by swapping weapons. Overall, a solid anarchic tier. The new Jumpstart Railgun is honestly a very useful addition to the arsenal. The electric shock that spreads out to nearby enemies does quite a bit of damage when you do pull it off, and can insta-kill most fodder enemies. Its cord staying attached while you switch to other weapons makes it a sort of a fire and forget weapon, and the fact that you have to stay quite close to the enemy you're attached to, unless it's a fodder enemy you can kill in a pinch, does mean you'll have to stay in the center of attention for longer. But let me tell you, the damage does pay off. Solid Supreme tier. The alternative Sawblade launcher, at least its blue variant, is in my opinion an even better weapon, since the Sawblades now circle in a wider radius around the magnets, covering more area and don't get destroyed the first few times they pierce an enemy, making fodder clearing and saw traps even more effective, both for fodder enemies and more beefy ones. Very easy shitstorm tier. The Jumpstart Sawblade launcher is something I haven't seen used much before, and that includes me. I feel like the cable functionality really fits the Nailgun more than the Sawblade launcher, as it kind of deviates from the saw trap playstyle of the other variants. I don't know, maybe it's because I haven't used it as much, but this variant does not feel very fun or rewarding to play. Destructive tier. Now onto the railguns. The blue electric railgun is the pinnacle of damage output in ULTRAKILL. Despite the long recharge, this piercing hit scan beast is absolutely insane to use with something like the Marksman coins, and even core projectiles from the blue shotgun, dishing out enormous amounts of damage. Probably one of my favorites in the game. ULTRAKILL tier. The screwdriver variant is a topic of kind of heated debate in the community. You either love it or hate it, nothing really in between. The steady stream of healing the drill provides when stuck to a beefy enemy is a very powerful healing tool, and is very often seen as a crutch. The fact that you can punch the drill into other enemies also opens up to some pretty cool combo opportunities on beefy targets like insurrectionists or mind flayers. Overall, a pretty solid weapon in my opinion. Supreme tier. The malicious rail cannon is the third and last variant of the railgun, but certainly not the least. The damage and combo potential of this variant is really good, being able to kill mind flayers and large groups of fodder in one shot. It does trade the piercing potential of the blue railgun for immense splash damage, and although it still has some neat interactions with coins and cores, it has a lot less going for it apart from maybe tech like a core nuke or an orbital blast. I don't catch myself using this variant too often, but I'll give it a solid anarchic tier from my experience. And at last, the rocket launchers. The blue or freeze frame variant is used a lot more as a movement utility than a weapon, primarily due to its secondary fire, which gives it a new echelon of ability, especially useful in the cyber grind. Overall a pretty good launcher, but kind of finicky as a weapon per se, except for maybe countering gutter tanks or synchronized bombings and such. Brutal tier. The SRS cannon is my personal favorite rocket launcher. Apart from normal rockets, it also has the cannonball, which has a lot of potential for interactions and combos, even managing to insta-kill some beefy enemies like the Cerberus. Overall, not much to say other than it's really fun and rewarding to use. Supreme tier. And at last, the Firestarter rocket launcher. The Alt Fire is not only good for both crowd clearing or targeting singular heavies for a ton of extra damage, but also doubles as a pretty neat mobility tool due to the oil preserving your momentum when you slide on it. Also, it's kind of a funny coincidence that you can oil up big naked men with it and they take a lot more damage from you. What did Hikita mean by this? Overall, a very solid sadistic tier. Did you really think I forgot about the arms? The feedbacker is pretty much the staple of ULTRAKILL. Not only does it give the opportunity to completely negate a projectile or a direct attack with a well-timed parry, but also heals you considerably in the process. The arm stays useful in pretty much every situation in the game. What kind of moron would I be not to put it in ULTRAKILL tier? The Knuckle Blaster is probably one of the most underrated weapons in the game, and yes, I say weapon because this arm is much less of a utility than the other two, providing much more damage output with both its direct and area attacks. I feel like it gets really slept on when it comes to utilization, as newer players tend to opt out on the Knuckle Blaster in favor of the flashier parry mechanic of the feedbacker. Other than constantly getting in my way when I try to parry something, the Knuckle Blaster is an amazing addition to the arsenal, although somewhat situational. Sadistic tier. The Whiplash is the last arm we get to experience after beating V2's shit in. Again, it's pretty much just a movement utility, but it does a great job at it, even synergizing with weapons like the Jackhammer or the Marksman coins to deliver very high damage outputs or do some fancy tech. It's also kinda useful for speedrunning later levels that include skulls or torches, but that's kinda it. It's still a very useful and robust utility arm, don't get me wrong. It helps in a lot of fights, but doesn't do the dreaded heart damage on use when you're on lower style levels. I'll give it a nice sadistic tier. So, that was that for the tier list. Make sure to write a comment down below about your personal rankings and about what I should rank next. As always, this was Cold Brew, thank you so much for watching, make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Cheers!